Charge your batteries while you drive or with the sun using our DC to DC chargers. Built with a high heat tolerance, these DC to DCs have the advantage of being able to run in the engine bay, which is great for those that have an older vehicle or for anyone looking to save some space by having their setup under the bonnet. Let's get into the install. Start by getting all your pieces together. Get your DC to DC, some split tube, electrical tape, solder, heat shrink, a bunch of cable ties, ring terminals, butt terminals, some fasteners, a couple of MIDI fuses, a mini blade tap, and we're using some 13.5 square mil gauge wires to help get everything installed. Now for a couple of optionals. We've decided to use an aftermarket fuse bracket to help us organise our wiring, and we've actually got a DC to DC bracket in here too. These aren't needed, but they're really going to help us out on this Hilux install. It's now time to raid the toolbox. Get your hands on all the normal stuff. A drill, screwdrivers, socket set, pliers, crimpers, a couple of spanners, and some scissors. After that, grab a heat gun and a clamp meter. Here's a couple of things you want to think about before getting stuck into it. Find a suitable place to mount your charger. We recommend having the charger as close as possible to the auxiliary battery. In our setup, it's under the bonnet, but in yours, it might be in the back of the cab or in the canopy. For the DC to DC, if you're mounting in the engine bay, pick a place that's going to maximise the airflow going to the charger. You'll also want to think about your cabling too. Make sure it's not going to run anywhere that makes you get cut or encounter too much heat. Away from moving parts and sharp edges is a great start. For your fuses and cabling, make sure you're using the right size stuff. Our manual has a bunch of info in it, but for fuses, a 40 amp fuse is a must for the 25 amp charger, and a 60 amp fuse should be used for the 40 amp version. This is how we're going to wire up the DC to DC. There's 3 connections: a crank battery, auxiliary battery, and a solar input. On your workbench, for this setup, we're going to start by lopping those Anderson style plugs off. If you're mounting your DC to DC in the back of the vehicle, you'll want to keep them and use one of our cable kits, but for this setup, we're going to get rid of them. Jagged cuts here are going to be one of your Auto Sparky's top tips. It's going to future-proof your cables and make sure that they're not going to get too much wear. To show you what we're doing, we've decided to extend the wiring to suit the space now, but it may be easier for you to do when you've mounted the DC to DC into place. We're just using some heat shrink, extra cabling, and some butt terminals to do this. Don't forget to attach the ring terminals to the cables too. Next, mount the DC to DC in place using your mounting hardware. There are a couple of go-to spots under the bonnet, but we've decided to use an aftermarket DC to DC mount and put it in front of the radiator, behind the grille. Now let's get our wiring sorted. We've already extended our wiring, but if you haven't already, now's the time to do it. We're running cables through some split tubing and routing it through the panels on the vehicle body. This will help to keep it away from anything that may do it some harm, and we're using a bunch of cable ties to help us out. Make sure to run the cables through a fuse. We've got a couple here. One's going to the starter battery, the other's going to the auxiliary battery, and this third one is nothing to worry about. We're using it for a light bar on the Hilux. Now it's time to get our inputs connected. The alternator cables will go over the terminals on the starter battery. The solar input should be run either to a roof mounted panel, otherwise wire up an Anderson style plug to have it ready for your portable panel. The last input is the ignition lead, which will only need to be wired in if you've got a smart alternator. Now, if you're looking for a way to find out if your vehicle has a smart alternator, you can either plug it into Google or look for a small plastic box that'll sit over the top of your negative battery terminal. If you find that your vehicle does have a smart alternator, all you're going to need to do is run that mini blade tap into an ignition source on your factory fuse panel. Then, get that small blue lead and connect it up to the tail of the mini blade tap. For us, we don't have a smart alternator, so we're just going to chop that blue ignition lead right back to the DC to DC and isolate it with some heat shrink. Our last couple of connections are going to the auxiliary battery. The eyelets will go onto their respective terminals on the battery, then it's just a matter of setting the charger. Hold the mode button down for a couple of seconds, it'll then move the LED indicator to the right. Just repeat this step until you've landed on your auxiliary battery type. Last step, grab that clamp meter and put it over the leads on the DC to DC charger. If you've got a positive current coming through, you're onto a winner. And that's everything done. Your DC to DC will now get your battery charged up anytime the vehicle's on, or if you're parked up, it'll regulate your solar input and get it into your battery instead. Need some more info? Check out the DC to DC's user manual or contact our Hardkorr support team today.